This is John Paul II, who became Pope in 1978. His Polish name was Karol Wojtyla, and he was the first non-Italian Pope in 4 centuries. He had grown up experiencing the totalitarianism of both Nazi Germany when Poland was occupied, and then communism after World War II. To this day, he's a huge hero to the Polish people, including my wife's grandmother, who has photos and images of John Paul II all over her house outside Warsaw in Poland. John Paul's election invigorated the Polish Catholic Church, which at this point was the most vibrant of all the Catholic churches under communist rule. There was a general narrative, as we've talked about before, of secularization in North America and Europe, and that secularization was seen as being especially advanced under communism. But in 1979, John Paul II visited Poland, where he was met by ecstatic crowds that ultimately included as much of as a third of the population of Poland. And here's John Paul speaking to one massive such crowd. It was another major moment that opened people's eyes to the fact that secularization was not the only story throughout the world, that there were many places where religion, including Christianity, was thriving. And it was out of this Catholic rejuvenation that what is known as the Solidarity movement emerged in Poland. And this was a Catholic movement of resistance against the communist regime. And the Catholic Church itself was viewed as a focal point of that resistance. John Paul's strong opposition to communism, which again he had experienced growing up, led him to be very critical of liberation theology. He visited Latin America in 1979 and encountered it at a conference in Puebla, Mexico. In 1984, the Roman Catholic Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, led by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, a future pope, issued an instruction on some aspects of liberation theology, in which it declared liberation theology a severe deviation from Christian faith and described it as a humanistic theology rooted in Marxism with little place for God's revealed truth. Now, this was a severe blow, but liberation theologians claimed that it was such a caricature of liberation theology that it did not adequately describe their views, and so that what it condemned had no resemblance to what they taught. So in 1986, Ratzinger issued a new document, his Instruction on Christian Freedom and Liberation. This document condemned inequity and other social evils and called Christians to take action against injustice, but at the same time it condemned the ideology, as it saw it, of liberation theology. Meanwhile, in the United States, President Ronald Reagan, who, as you'll recall, was heavily supported by evangelicals, the religious right, and by conservative Catholics, took an increasingly militant and aggressive posture toward the Soviet Union. He publicly called it an evil empire, using sort of religious language, and he increased military spending. In 1987, in a speech in front of the Berlin Wall, which divided communist East Berlin from democratic West Berlin, he famously confronted the Soviet leader, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And Reagan's policies are largely credited with pushing the Soviet Union to the brink of economic collapse. Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, was already convinced that communism and the Cold War were crushing the Soviet economy and that his country could not win. While the United States and Western Europe were thriving economically, the Soviet Union was declining more and more. So he began to open up the country. And during the late 1980s, Gorbachev relaxed the intense restrictions on Christianity. Russian Orthodox churches began to reopen, as did the churches of other denominations that had long been prohibited, such as Baptists and Catholics. And during the late 1980s, communism began to collapse throughout Eastern Europe. And in many countries, Catholic and Orthodox churches played a significant role in publicly celebrating the downfall of communist regimes. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed, with many countries breaking away and becoming independent, including Ukraine, and leaving Russia as a quasi-democratic state. Nevertheless, it's important to note that for all the inspirational stories about Christianity in Eastern Europe and under communism, the reality is that communism's effect on Christianity had been devastating, both in Europe, and Eastern Europe, and Northern Asia, especially for the Orthodox Church, whose numbers were far lower than they had been before the communist revolution of 1917-1918. Now, the fall of communism discouraged many liberation theologians because it left capitalism dominant in the world. As Gonzalez puts it, the earlier expectation of many among them that a liberating process already in existence would soon bring about a more just social order was postponed. It now seemed that there was little opposition to liberal capitalism, and that the increasing inclusion of Latin America into a global economy would lead to even more inequity and poverty. And the CEBs that we talked about before, these base ecclesiastical communities, many of them began to wither away and ultimately be disestablished. Ironically, however, this led to complicated results. On the one hand, the mainstream church, thanks to the collapse of communism, because the Soviet Union was no longer in existence, the mainstream church no longer felt threatened by liberation theology. And many theologians began to engage it in a more constructive way and even appropriate key insights from it, such as the preferential option for the poor. And so while the sort of the full-orbed Latin American liberation theology went into decline, and the Catholic Church in some ways became more conservative, at the same time, certain ideas from liberation theology actually became more mainstream. And the current Pope Francis, who's of course the first ever Latin American Pope, gives you a pretty good idea of what Latin American Catholicism has become. Pope Francis is theologically and morally very conservative, much more conservative than liberation theology in the 70s would have been. But on the other hand, he's very socially conscious and concerned about the social implications of Catholicism. So it's interesting to note that as a political and even revolutionary movement, liberation theology no longer has much influence compared to what it once did, but that some of its theological ideas have actually arguably gained influence in the broader church. But what's also worth noting is that today, Pentecostalism, which mostly rejects liberation theology, is far more influential and vibrant among Latin American Christians than liberation theology. The Catholic Church has been shrinking. Many of the people in Latin America are only nominal Catholics, as many people from those countries will tell you. And much of the growth in Christianity, the vibrancy, the thriving has been happening among Pentecostal groups. And in fact, even within Latin American Catholicism, much of the vibrancy that does exist is in a charismatic Catholic movement that's been heavily influenced by Pentecostalism. Scholars have described Pentecostalism as a response to the failed revolutionary expectations of earlier years, the heyday of liberation theology. And interestingly, Pentecostalism in the long run had greater appeal to the downtrodden in Latin America than liberation theology did. As one scholar put it, the Catholic Church has chosen the poor, but the poor chose the Pentecostals. Many Pentecostals embraced free market capitalism and prosperity, even health and wealth prosperity gospel, and they rejected revolutionary activism. That's not true across the board. There are some Pentecostals who are very concerned about social engagement. But in general, Pentecostals tended to be much more conservative, sometimes even supporting repressive conservative governments, as Jenkins talks about in the reading. So Christianity in Latin America, in the wake of liberation theology, is undergoing fascinating changes. And we'll continue to discuss those changes going into the next lecture.